Hello, beautiful community. I'm so sorry for the technical problems we've had. You're so welcome. This is going to be a short one because I am working on a main channel video for everybody, and it's taking a little longer than I'd hoped, even though it's a rant. It's my first ever main channel rant. Everybody, success presumably means that you can hear me. Success presumably means that you can hear me. It's 700 o'clock in the morning, European time at least. So it's probably going to be four and a half of us here. Hello, Peter. Hello, everybody. Hello, Jessica. Everybody, you're so welcome. This is going to be probably just a short, run about half an hour chat while I work on a main channel video for Sunday. It's taking longer because it's getting a bit of an edit, even though it was a rant about something that really pisses me off. I mean, it's of course going to be educational, so it's going to be partly serious that I'm pissed off, and partly me exploiting that to make some interesting remarks about the world in which we all live. What is going on down there? I'm not sure we're going to be doing any Arnold impressions today. 7:42, Jessica in Florida. You're so welcome, everybody. I mean, what is going on, right? Werner Herzog, a Werner Herzog impression requires some practice. It requires some practice. There is a Werner Herzog impression from about 15 years ago on my main YouTube channel. I think I haven't deleted it. Or it's got terrible audio because I paid 50p for that microphone I used. So the war, I don't do impressions. I don't have actorly talents. I don't. I think I can do a little bit of two football impressions, which is Arsene Wenger and Jose Mourinho. I do a little bit. I used to do a little bit of Tony Blair, and I can do a tiny bit of random people like Werner Herzog or Arnie as well. But it's not really my thing. No, I could never do Michael Caine, Matt. Never Boris. So there is a certain sense, everybody, before I take a few questions, I'm not going to keep you here long. It's just a way of reconnecting. I'm aware I've been absent for 2 days on the chat channel because of the main channel project. The war is globalizing in a way we have not discussed before yet and won't discuss today, but it's just worth mentioning. And that's to say, the longer the war goes on, the more various kinds of global actors are going to put it systematically to their benefit. So Ukraine is becoming increasingly a kind of puck of more and more global actors, more and more systematically. And that will only continue. The other thing that I think is worth saying, and maybe it'll come out soon on the chat on Anna from Ukraine's channel. But the other point that's really worth making is that Ukrainians, I think, are going to be feeling in a new way around this time the indefiniteness of the war, right? As there is a perceived transition from a short to medium term war to what may be a longer term war, there is a new reckoning with what is it, how long is it going to last, and where are we going to land? And I think that, short of some kind of miraculous counteroffensive breakthrough in the coming weeks, that is going to be a very important redefinition, psychological redefinition. A lot of Ukrainians will have to go through. And I think that's psychologically interesting, psychologically significant. It's hard to live with hard stuff. Some of you who are ill, for example, who are seriously ill, know that. Um, but it's harder to live with hard stuff that is indefinite, right? Both in terms of its duration, but also in terms of its shape, right? So why not have a look at some questions. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want to talk about BRICS today, um, but I promise we'll discuss it in a more global perspective. There are people asking about it. Pavel is asking a question. Let's see if I can make something of it. Hey, Pavel. If miraculously Putin decides to put down all weapons and take full blame, well, then I'm Santa Claus. What would the West's punishment for Russia be, if any? Um, would it be any different if Putin went down fighting? I think it's too late for Putin now, Pavel. I think that I if I tie that back to the opening comment I made, then for the United States, this war is part of a global approach to global threats and global opportunities, right? It includes thinking about China, for example, right? How the United States deals with Russia is connected with how the United States thinks about the challenge it may have with China. But within all of that wash, there is something like a high price, high cost strategy for Russia. These are the words of the Ukrainian philosopher Andrei Baumeister. Actually, he calls the appropriate post-war consequences that he wants high cost consequences for Russia. Right, that if you do the sorts of stuff Russians have got up to, the cost is going to have to be very high and very systemic. So inevitably, that's going to be Russia's experience whatever happens next. The only way Russia moderates that is if it makes a bunch of um, not so much concessions, but a bunch of steps that are anyway in its objective interests, that the West wants it to make, and that may include anything from um, getting out of Ukraine, new security arrangements to democratization. But if Putin apologized tomorrow, nobody could possibly take him seriously, because he has already locked the regime onto a certain path that involves both regime security and a certain uh, external escalation mission, which are connected. And getting off these rails is not something Putin himself can do. And even if he woke up tomorrow, as you are suggesting he might, he wouldn't be able to do it. The globalization of the war, in the way I've discussed it, plays against Ukraine's favor. The more multi-agent this conflict becomes, the more Ukraine's going to be just in that kind of a wash. Although the wash is not too extreme at the moment, it's largely dictated by the strategic vision or lack thereof of the United States. Sumiland, what do you think of American Republicans saying Trump supporters will cause violence if Trump isn't on the ballot? Well, we're talking about a candidate of such great polarization that whatever happens with him, success or failure, is a profound, um, harbinger of political instability in the United States. So the way out of that is unavailable. Really, I mean, it's about moderating the consequences and engaging in various kinds of contortions. Right, and one of the contortions I have recently suggested is the contortion of treating people who treat you like enemies as opponents, which is a very difficult thing to do because they're treating you like enemies. Why should you treat them like opponents? But you're really reaching a point in the United States where political behavior ought to be existential. Now, it ought to be anyway existential because of the climate crisis, but putting that aside, political behavior ought to be existential because you've always got to ask, given how close you are to perilous democratic destabilization, you've got to ask, is this approach to me beating out my political opponents um, going to do more than is reasonably acceptable to destabilize, right? To destabilize our democracy further. So, unfortunately, now political combat has to be put through this existential filter in the United States. And where you might be convinced you're right on a certain issue, going for your opponent in a certain way might, be something that could have worked 20 years ago. Today it might work, but you need to be careful about the stability of the boat. So, and this is really going to be increasingly true of other democracies. As folks are having a polarized conflict on a ship, they've got to keep checking whether the way they're positioning themselves in the conflict isn't increasing the uh, you know tilt and instability of the ship so that it sinks. If it sinks, these conflicts become irrelevant, quite frankly, because if democratic institutions are missing, no constructive political project could be Aussie T. Welcome to you too. And thanks for being here. Mm, Nothing can be achieved, right, once you lose functional democratic institutions. That's the sort of paradoxical way in which the democratic issues, the democratic recession issues, the decline of democratic institutions, all of that stuff is intertwined with everything, literally everything, right? From global security to national speed limits. Whatever project you got, if these institutions aren't working, there is nothing for it to sort of pull it through. Stephen is saying the KGB trained Trump. I'm very disinclined to be positively sort of um, disposed to that direction, really, even though lots of people take it. Even a very beautiful man who you all know, Tim Snyder, takes it, right? He often says, well, Trump's a bit foreign sponsored, and then because he is foreign sponsored, that was so important that it may have made the difference in him winning in 2016. I find that very damaging, these comments. First, because they're not substantiated. What can you establish, right? It that Russian interference made what kind of a difference, right? 0.5% difference, 1% difference, 0.25% difference, 4% difference. Well, let's be maximalist in that sense here. Let's say 4% difference. Well, where's the other 96%, right? You're talking about um, an overwhelmingly domestic challenge that is slightly spiked by malevolent foreign interference. And you've got to keep two things in your mind here: that it is spiked by the foreign interference, but it is overwhelmingly global. Um, Now, I'm not an American citizen, but obviously what I can't do is then say mean things about Trump, because that covers half of the um, you know a third of the U.S. Citizenry, folks who are sort of available to him as voters, and because of the profound crisis of trust, um, it's enormously important to understand how they feel, um, just like it's important to understand how depoliticized Russians feel. Um, what Trump is an extravagantly brilliant communicator in his own way, and he is also a true master of exploiting people's vulnerabilities. And he's managed to very successfully translate that from the business world to the world of politics. And Trump is not authentic in the sense that he has integrity, that he's sincere, and so on, but he's authentic in the sense that he is real. He is what he is. And that's enormously compelling in the age of, as careful as we should be about that word in the age of populism. And I want to be careful about that word, because there can be good populism, there can be bad populism, and there is also such a thing as the inevitability of populism, right? So we can't just sit around here and say, "Oh, here the populists go again." McTeagle, thank you. Vlad, I know you don't recognize the importance, but there's evidence of Russian involvement with Brexit. And while you can downplay the effect on the result, it did get it. No, you can't say that. You can't. I mean, you can be an ideologue, Matt, and say that, but you can't say that responsibly. So, and I'd go further than that. You can downplay the Russian involvement, but it did get it over the line. I'm going to go further, Matt. I don't believe you believe what you've said. If we put you in a lie detector now, I'm skeptical you would stick to that. I don't mean to be mean at all. I'm just deliberately staying with this because it's so important to get the way we frame this right. Because there really is interference, and it really is aimed at destabilizing our democracies. And obviously, as a philosopher, this is not so important for me to put front and center, but I'm very strongly a Remainer. I don't share the sort of pious Fukuyamianism of the way the Remainers are conducting their debate with Brexiteers, but I am as psychologically European as is possible to get. Um, so, um, in fact, um, because of how the vote turned, this should not be said in public. Should this be said in public? Well, now I've begun saying it. Okay, I'll say it. Um, so, and then I'll come back to being mean to you, Matt. Um, I, as a British citizen, lost on Brexit. Uh, I voted Remain, but I lost, which means I take responsibility for the outcome, right? I'm ethically responsible for the outcome because fellow citizens who wanted a different result to me got their result and I lost. Moreover, I accept my defeat. In other words, I recognize that the result is legitimate and I might think it's destructive, counterproductive, whatever, that's secondary. The result is legitimate and therefore I accept the process has generated the result I don't want. And speaking of I don't want, in my case, it's really don't want. Um, it's not existential in the sense that things in Ukraine are existential, but it's existential to some extent, right? Um, so I was right about Trump. I felt Trump would win. I said Trump would win before 2016. I want to be very soft here because I felt it was 50-50, really. But I felt Trump would win. And that was my view. I missed Brexit. In other words, I thought it was going to be very, very close, but it wasn't clear it was going to go the Brexit way to me. I wasn't clear about that. I was really, it felt like a coin toss. But at the end of the evening, and I voted very late at night, I voted something like at 10 in the evening. The bookies, for some reason, shifted even more strongly toward Remain as the outcome. And I had a glass of champagne because that's the outcome I personally wanted. To wake up to the next day to a quite different outcome, to the one I thought had occurred and indeed that I celebrated. It was a mock celebration a bit, of course, because Brexit, what I did know, even though I didn't expect it to go that way on the day, I knew Brexit was the trend. And there was a global trend, and that was apparent, and hence that's why I was more bullish on Trump. And it's unconstructive for a philosopher to admit that because to me it's a 77th order thing that I have one preference versus another when it comes to discussing issues in a very constructive way. But nevertheless, there you go. So that's my personal relationship with this particular issue, Matt. But I think that the risks involved here are far greater than miscalculation, right? So I don't want to say, oh, Matt, you're going for 1%, and actually you should be at 0.5% on the impact of Russian interference. That's not what the debate is about. If that was the difference, I'd say, Matt, legit, but pretty much in the same ballpark. So why am I being mean? Theatrically mean. It's this. 90% of professional academic friends of mine who voted Remain believe that the vote the other way was a product of irrationality, corruption, and malign foreign interference. That's to say that the preponderance of their energy goes on engaging with a very small minority of the causation. Right? And of course, we want to do both. We want to engage with the Russian interference. But the preponderance of one's energy has got to go to working out why on earth, right, domestic political and cultural currents are generating this result and how they're tied up to global patterns, right? And it's in that light, right? It's in the light of externalizing our problems and thinking that our democracies are still boats in the bay when they're out at sea. We need to start thinking very differently about this, right? So you see what's at stake with your statement, Matt. Your statement is conducive to amnesia about Western democratic recession, which is conducive to um, a lack of constructive action to try to mitigate the consequences of that recession, of that democratic decline. That's why my advice is never going to be stop saying what you're saying. So I'm just telling you off theatrically. But my advice is please carry on saying exactly what you've said. If you've thought about it 3 times, very seriously about that formulation, and you still think that's what you want to say because you want to emphasize Russian interference, that's really important to you, let's say, right? Do it, but elevate the intentionality there because that unintentional swish, oh, they got it over the line, is dangerous, right? And you're not lacking sophistication for saying it. As I've pointed out, Tim Snyder said that about Trump. Tim Snyder said that Trump was got over the line by Russian interference. He said that in an interview with a Russian journalist, oppositional Russian journalist in the West. And Tim said that in his capacity as an activist. You could say it's constructive of him to say that. You could say it's not constructive, but um, it's it's a culture war statement. It's not a statement that a sober historian, a sober academic historian would be able to make. Huge love to um, Tim Snyder, of course. He's done so much beautiful work that's moved so many people. And also love your way, Matt, and thank you for letting me tell you off for so long. And everybody, thank you for accommodating my telling off of Matt. And I'm gonna book into my anger management class just immediately after the live. Let me see what I missed while telling people off. Um, I'm gonna go to all live chat. Okay, I can see a few things. Michael, as an American, I greatly value your insistence that we not act and speak as though our political opponents are villains, whether or not we think so. It's piecemeal, right? Um, and you've got to act in a special way in each case. What I would say is that a difficult decision a politically engaged person at the moment in any country that faces an anti-democratic political movement has to face is, do I prioritize first saying no to these people and beating them out? Or do I say, um, we've got to understand how this came about and how we are part of the cause, right? So when um, 90% of Brexiteers or 90% of Remainers in the UK, for example, have a go at Brexiteers, my question to them is, what did you do to bring about a situation where people feel like that? Who did you vote for that contributed to bringing about a situation that made people feel like that? But even here, we've got to be careful because very often the answer is that there were many mistakes, but the mistakes don't exhaustively explain things. Global trends that are beyond any intentional decisions often explain things too, right? But anyway, it's that very important balance. Do we just resist and say no and fight? Or do we engage in analysis of what we did to bring this about? You need both, but you need a political priority between the two. And the political priority that I recommend is actually, contrary to what I've been saying the last 20 minutes, arguably, is no, you've got to resist first. You've got to say, no, this is unacceptable. So, for example, when major politicians lie, you have to call it out. When they lie so systematically that it's no longer lying, but it's post-truth, right? It's destabilizing the very difference between lies and truth. You've got to call it out, right? And mostly major institutions are scared to do that, right? They're scared to call out the lies of the, you know, government in power, let's say. But you've got to do it. So you gotta say no, and you've got to start saying no early, and you've got to normalize saying no early, um, which is difficult, right? It's really difficult for an institution like the BBC in the UK, for example, that is already under such deep pressure, deep assault from different directions, and many internal flaws and mistakes too. Um, that themselves have existential. But it's very difficult for the BBC to take a stance which says, ladies and gentlemen, Boris Johnson has lied for the 77th time this month, right? It's difficult. Um, Brexit, Sumilan, Brexit and Trump are part of the same global pattern. Heather, thank you. The Blue Hawk. I like to think some Western elites are pro Russian as a way to criticize the West without criticizing the West. I don't know what elites are explicitly pro Russian, but I think you're making an important point that there's a lot of anti Putin sentiment, which isn't really pro Putin, it's anti Putin. Um, Legitimate comments that you can roughly guess are by US citizens in particular that are very positive, and the Putin videos on YouTube are interesting to read, but they're all in this mode of lack of faith in anything that American institutions do. They aren't about Putin at all, because Putin is, of course, a incomparably more dreadful instantiation of everything they claim to dislike. Charles. A concerted and well-funded effort to change minds could have a dramatic effect on an eager audience. There is evidence. Why ignore it? Not sporting. Not sure I get that last bit. I'm sorry, maybe being slow. Underneath irrationality, there's lack of trust. Underneath irrationality, there is lack of trust. And it's a problem if we are in a social situation in which millions of citizens find it oppressive to admit the truth. Um, Lucky Yona Jr. You often mention insightful Russian commentators who should be followed. Now, I've been promising this. It's purely because I've got caught up that I haven't done it. I will be sharing a video on the chat channel with good sources. There's plenty of people I really um, uh, trust, and I'll offer some names for YouTube, for Twitter. Now, of course, the preponderance of my consumption about Russia is probably in Russian, um, but I'll give you all the good English stuff that I know. There's plenty of it. Actually, there is plenty of it. Um, Anne is saying that that's one of my favorite comments that I've seen, and she's saying that about Nolan. Let's have a look what Nolan said. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Oh no. Oh no. That I would make an okay Bond villain. I don't think I would make a good Bond villain. But the time calm under pressure is genuinely a characteristic of mine. Teach me guitar is asking about Armenia. I can answer with a generic comment. Um, and the generic comment is that the Russian state is um, going to seed uncertainty and instability in everybody who borders it or nearly borders it. And the less one can have to do with it, the better within reason. Russia in its current incarnation is completely unsustainable for soft or hard power um, guarantees. So I'm sorry, I'm just making a generic comment here, but that's, I think, a generalization that holds. I'm actually allergic to cats. I like cats. I prefer cats to dogs. I'm a pig person. The only pets I've owned are pigs. I had used to have 2 pigs. Um, Michael is doing clarification, saying, "I was speaking not of politicians who may act treacherously, but of fellow citizens with whom I disagree politically." Let's scroll back and see. Yeah, with citizens is really important. I mean, the demonization of citizens who are completely delusional is a problem, and it's itself a kind of a political evil, even when you're right on the facts, as it were. Yeah, I'll show you when I do a personal Q&A. I'll show you a video of my pig Hillary, um, who I had in Tonga, um, which was very unusual. I was the only person in the country with a pet pig. Um, but one of my pigs ran away. So when I say 2 pigs, I mean actually only one. My little pig Ruby ran away because I didn't pig-proof the fence perfectly enough. And Ruby came when he was tiny because he was rejected by his mom. Um, so basically, my only pig was Hillary, and she thought I was her mom, which is very spoiled and very demanding. Side quest here. I recently found a friend of mine who recommended a book by Dugin. Do you think there is any value in reading work from more extremist political philosophers? To that, the answer is obviously yes, but they need to be good. Um, so my um, great still living colleague Alistair McIntyre thinks that Heidegger, in his view, should have been executed after the Second World War, but also that Heidegger should be read. So, of course, there are two types of extremism: extremism in their biography and extremism in life. Um, I am sure there are some things Dugin has written that are sound or interesting or provocative. Um, but my answer to that really would be quality based. Why would you want to read Dugin when you're going to be dead before having read so many books that are really going to, tremendously impact your life? But if you're going down a Dugin rabbit hole and it's fascinating for you, then I think that's, perfectly permissible. Um, and there is a guy on YouTube. I don't know if he supports Russia or he's at least sort of somewhere between being neutral and supporting Russia in this war. He is genuinely a professional political philosopher. His name is Michael Milliman, I think. I did a video on him on the chat channel, saying, or maybe that wasn't even on the philosophy channel. Um, could anybody conceivably support Russia in this war and do so, without BSing, something like that? And as you know, I've discussed Dugin a bit too. Um, so I'd be conservative. I'd say read Dugin to get to read Dugin. Read Dugin to find out more about Dugin, but don't read Dugin to find out more about geopolitics. That's I think how I would put it. Oh, oh no, we've lost an audience member here. We've lost an audience member. This must be the first time we've lost someone for behavior I don't enjoy in the community. But it was just a passer through, perhaps. Onuce Paseva. Could Russia ease the? We're just going to go a little bit more only. Could Russia ease the consequences on herself if the Putin demise were to come from the inside and from the outside? What would it mean for his demise to come from the outside? Obviously, it can't directly come from the outside. Nobody's going to invade Russia. If it came from the outside in the sense that Putin didn't survive Ukraine hypothetically retaking Crimea, then that would still be, I'd guess, a case of it happening from the inside. So I can't imagine a case of it being spurred from the outside that I would still call anything other than a case of it primarily happening from inside, right? If Putin has lost Crimea and if Putin has drifted away even from people close to him, there's going to be a change, but that change is not going to be, it's going to be a series of cracks in the regime, right? And that's the sort of painful thing, that even on the best case scenario of a Ukrainian victory that doesn't lead to nuclear war, Putin doesn't necessarily go. Whether he goes depends on what happens inside the Putin regime. And so even a comprehensive military victory for Ukraine with a total eviction of Russia does not remotely guarantee the end of the war. It makes the end of the war enormously plausible, if not indeed even likely, but that likelihood, if it is there at all, is a marginal one because Putin could survive all of that. So it's hard to imagine an external expulsion of Putin, short of you going over there and um, putting him in a box and bringing him over to The Hague. Oh gosh, serious, Holger, you're asking a question absolutely central to Western political philosophy. Should freedom of speech also protect opinions which oppose freedom of speech? That might be a very good title for a philosophy channel episode. It's a very basic question. Let me just say something not so resplendently philosophical about it. And that's that there isn't going to be a universal answer because the answer will have to be commensurate with the political history and the culture of a particular country, right? The United States, it has an enormously different speech culture to Germany, right? What constitutes responsible speech will be thought about, all things being even. Of course, these are terribly pluralistic countries internally, especially the United States. But speech will be responsible speech will be thought about terribly differently by these different political cultures, and so there are going to be different practical answers. Now, what I would say, however, is that too often in the abstract Twitter varieties of this debate, people pile in to defend free speech because it's a sort of end in itself. And that's all one needs to know. And you can get quite some way like this, but what you've really got to emphasize is how you lose friction from reality if you lose free speech in certain parts of society, in certain institutional contexts, right? So that's another part of the answer. Free speech where, right? Um, so there is a difference between academic free speech and free speech in the media, free speech in some kind of public square like this, right? The answers aren't going to be the same. For example, in the academic context, my tolerance is extremely high for all kinds of remarks. In the academic context, for me, unless you are fairly directly threatening violence, you get to speak. Um, so that would be one kind of resolution to the tension you're proposing. Um, in the academy, I'm not at all open to people saying, well, my identity is impacted by this person being invited to speak. Can they be deplatformed? No, sorry, they won't be deplatformed. And I have a personal policy that I will not myself speak at events where people, often who I strongly disagree with, have been deplatformed. I won't go into the details, maybe I will at some point, but certainly in the UK context, that there are some names with whom I might disagree, but if I hear that they got deplatformed, I won't speak there. Let's take a couple of more questions. Suzanne, great to have you. Robert, if you oppose freedom of speech, you should walk your talk and thus keep your opinion to yourself. Look, I, I, I think that one thing I would say, thank you, Robert, is that the rant that's coming up on the main channel, hopefully on Sunday, from me, is going to be a very peculiar contradiction of what I normally say on this, because in my view, there is actually one area and only one area in which words might indeed be not just as bad, but possibly even worse than sticks and stones. And I'll explain why that's the case. But it's only one very specific and quite um, special area. But outside that, my own um, statement on this is that words are not sticks and stones. I remember I was once doing a talk and somebody raised their hand in real life, and somebody raised their hand and asked me how I don't define gross social injustice as violence. And then they gave an example of somebody in a particular country. This was years ago, being socially disadvantaged in so many ways that they even were discriminated against in the banking system. They couldn't bank properly. Please don't think this is a Nigel Farage story. This is totally different. And I said, I'm sorry. Oh, and they said, and that's a case of violence. Why is it a case of violence? Well, because if you're disadvantaged that way, then that can physically affect you. And then if it physically affects you, it is kind of physical, and so it is kind of violence, right? So, if I invite a very conservative and homophobic philosopher to speak on campus, and somebody who's gay says, look, I don't want to hear them because it's violence, I don't buy that at all. The argument will be, well, hang on, that speech will peddle a bunch of prejudice. And if it peddles prejudice, it'll make life for gay people harder. But it also might affect me emotionally. It might affect my nervous system. It might make me depressed. There's a kind of a physical process. I might be in physical pain from that. And I might get discriminated against. Somebody might shout at me. And if somebody shouts at me some homophobic abuse on campus, having heard that speech, then that might make me feel terrible and not welcome, and that's even if that's a physical experience. So even if nobody attacks me, it's still a kind of physical assault on me. It's violence. No, I completely reject that. I think that's a, an, a use of the term that you could just about stretch in that way, while making some kind of um, theoretical point in a literature department seminar, sure. But if you're talking about basic hardcore campus politics, like who's going to do what, who's not allowed to do what, my answer to that is, well, it's profoundly offensive if it's homophobic. I don't agree with it. Don't like it, don't come. Don't like it, come and tell that speaker that they're a moron. Raise their hand and say, well, your speech is stupid and you don't understand anything. On that goes. Don't want to do that. Hire the whole the next day after that speaker leaves, and you say, the very opposite of what they've said, and explain why they were prejudicial and wrong. So, I've gone on a tangent, but I'm very slow. This is particularly popular in some social justice circles in the United States, to call structural disadvantage structural violence, and I just do not politically accept that one goes. There are certain people of ideological persuasions that say, well, there isn't anything structural going on at all. There's no systemic disadvantage, and that I don't accept. So I accept a lot of the arguments about very systemic disadvantage, but I don't think very systemic deprioritization disadvantage is violence. Partly because a Ukrainian child whose apartment blocks got hit by a Russian rocket knows what the violence is, right? being edged out of life opportunities in sort of a plethora of pernicious, semi perceptible ways is bad, but it's not violence. Anyway, always a problem with ranting that I have today. Nobody resolved the paradox of tolerance. Last question, we'll take it from Phil. Sorry, this has not been as Ukraine oriented as I'd hoped, actually, but that's totally fine. I just wanted to connect with you guys, really, because I've been away for a couple of days focusing on the main channel video. Phil is saying, but if you get to decide who talks at your seminar, should you not select them? Yes, but if I select them, I'm going to be open to selecting people whose views I don't like and whose views might even offend me, right? I mean, I was thinking of an actual example when I gave this homophobia example. That was a situation at the university that's got thrown out by Viktor Orban and is now in Vienna, the Central European University, where the late British conservative philosopher Roger Scruton was speaking, and he had a mass exodus from his talk because of silly things he'd said about homosexuality across his life. He wasn't talking about that. He was talking about conservative philosophy. Um, so I'd invite people who I find offensive and even sort of appalling intellectually. It wouldn't cross my mind not to. The only reason I wouldn't is if I thought that they had nothing constructive to offer. But a lot of the people who have some constructive things to offer might also offend me, but of course I'll invite them. So that's how I see that. What I don't want is a situation where somebody sits around in that place and says, "Well, I'll invite everyone except the people who offend me." Well, that is literally incompatible with the sustenance of the university as a liberal institution, which is in turn incompatible with the sustenance of democracy, because the university is, in a way that we often underestimate, an absolutely basic counter-majoritarian institution. No, Zach, this is a perfect question. This is really going to be the last question. Vlad, I get your point, but doesn't institutional racism that leads to statistically early death for the minorities add up to actual systemic violence? No, no. It can cause violence, but it is not itself violence, right? Um, all Western countries have known that my health condition, or should have known, the science was there, is real since about 1994. They haven't invested, for various complex reasons, the money they should have invested to make sure that people like me, and there are people much worse than me, right? But to make sure that people like me can work, you know, the full day instead of working 2 hours a day. I say I work 3 or 4 hours a day. I often misspeak. I just mean that I function very often 3 or 4 hours a day, which means doing other things too. So that's violent. I'm experiencing violent symptoms all the time. Having the physical experience that I'm having as a person with the chronic illness I have is very violent, to the point that most people in my position, uh, if they were put into it afresh without getting used to it, without the resilience, would be uh, questioning whether life is worth living, which I'm certainly not questioning. In fact, I'm incredibly in love with life. But where am I going with this? The idea that just because terrible policy has ended up in a situation where I am needlessly suffering, which is the analysis I've shared, the idea that that policy is itself violent, I think, misses something very basic, really very basic. And that's that if this conversation is being had in Russia today, right, even this little conversation with a few criticisms of Putin, we can get somebody at 5 in the morning breaking down our door, right? That is the paradigm of political violence. And that's why all kinds of systemic injustice, right, can cause violence in various ways, but it is not itself, in itself, violence. The fact that I might be experiencing something very bad physically because of very bad political decisions by politicians, by public health institutions, because there are many of me, that's what makes the political argument to fix my health condition strong. That does not make that policy violent. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. So that's because we lose so much in politics when we fudge very, very concrete cases. And that is why it's very important that we keep concepts like genocide or like violence or like a human right very, very clear. If I sit here and I pump up the idea of human right that involves, that includes my right to 3 meals a day, my right to housing, my right to not be discriminated in employment, I'm going to end up with a very persuasive package of rights, but it's not going to be clear they're human rights, right? And that's terrible because the concept of human rights does very special work. It helps us focus on the worst directly intentional things human beings do to each other, right? If you tell me that something really bad is going on, but we can't figure out how to stop it, then I don't think it's a case of human rights being violated, right? So when we've got a situation where people are being massacred in virtue of a direct political order, we can say human rights are at stake because this can be stopped by just telling X to stop doing what they're doing, right? And it's gone, right? But if we say it's a human right that people don't starve, well, it's not, because that has to go, hello, Vitali, that has to go with an account of agency. If people are starving, well, I think that might violate their rights plausibly, but it's not clear it violates their human right, because then we would need a very clear account of agency, like who should do what, how, and when to immediately bring a stop to this problem. And that kind of answer there is not available, because it's going to be about dramatic political and institutional failure, dramatic economic policy problems, and so on. That are going to get us to the answer: why are people, as it were, having cappuccinos in one part of the world and are in agony in another? So that's why we need certain very simple political concepts that need to stay simple, because then other concepts can be more complex and can accommodate the grayness and complexity of political life. But some concepts need to be simple, and that's why I'm a fan of keeping violence relatively simple. In other words, if I can't get 29-year-olds to agree that something is violent, then it might be terribly bad, completely unacceptable, wholly unjust, utterly intolerable, but it's not violent. So clearly, I've got some kind of a bug whereby I cannot stop ranting. So this was a series of 4 or 5 micro rants. I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much. I'll be in touch on the chat channel between today and the release of the main channel video. That's probably going to come on Sunday. It's such a blessing to have been with you. I'm enormously grateful for our conversation. I think we've got something going here that is a two-way situation, and two-way situations last a two-way situation can be here years from now because it's real and it's sustainable. I'm very grateful for you that we have the possibility to explore and cultivate that. And particularly sending love today to everybody in the audience who I have told off. And I promise I'm definitely immediately heading for my weekly, good night, Russell, for my weekly anger management class. Lots of love and catch you all really soon.